Sure.
That is
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session of Book the Words. Today is Saturday, 8th of August. Just a week, no, like almost 9 days before our hopefully Independence Day of Indonesia. But since all of us, not all of us, but already four of us that are here, shall we start immediately? Bibit, do you have to use the Zoom after this as well? No? Okay, sure. Um, Gusti, so your book is Gusti Sky Burial by Sinran. Are you ready?
okay. So I'm the first.
Sure. Why not?
Okay, so I don't have the book with me now because I borrow it from City Library and I've already returned it. But this is the book, the biographic novel of Dalai Lama. It's a comic, yeah.
Mhm.
I read this to know the context between China and Tibet at that time. So Sky Burial is a story about the writer Sinran was a radio announcer that worked in Nanjing, yeah. And in 1994, she got this interesting story from one of her listener that the listener met a strange woman, yeah, named Shu Wen, that is a Chinese woman that but dressed like a Tibet, like people from Tibet. And then she then go to Suzhou to where uh, the hotel where the woman live, and then interview her. Yeah, and the woman is already really old, yeah, like a granny. And then she had just went from Tibet for 30 years. And she went to Tibet for 30 years because she looked for her dead husband. So in 1950, yeah, in 1950, China, the government of China, conquer Tibet, yeah, conquer Tibet, and they said that they want to liberate that Tibet from Western imperialism. So I felt like the reason that China government used to conquer Tibet is the same as Japan when Japan tried to conquer us. Japan said that they wanted to liberate us from Netherlands, right? But actually they wanted to conquer us, and the same thing happened in Tibet. And China wanted to conquer Tibet because they wanted to secure what is it, the strategic location, yeah, strategic location. So they can uh, menguasai, ya, master the source, the water source of Asia, because in Tibet there is like apa ya, sumber sumber airnya, sumber air dari Cina, terus sumber air India itu start from Tibet gitu loh. So like if they conquer Tibet, those the regions around it cannot attack China because their water supply will be in danger. And also in Tibet there are so many like natural resources, yeah, natural resources that they want to mine, yeah, mining the natural resources. So that's why they wanted to conquer Tibet. But of course Tibet don't want to be conquered, right? But here's the irony, yeah. When before Tibet was conquered by China, there was a slavery in Tibet. So in the book there was a story about a slave that is fell in love with the the daughter of noble. Yeah, and at that time I was questioned like why Buddhist people have slave. Yeah, I thought Buddhism treat humans equally. Yeah, but at that time, the nobles and the people of religions, yeah, the monks, they use concept of karma to apa ya untuk govern people ya. So like they said that those people are poor because they have sins in the past and they can pay their sins, so they will be reborn as a human with a better life if they serve the nobles and the monks. And after China conquered them, then slavery is deleted from Tibet. So it's like, yeah, the irony of it. And the story itself is uh, at that time, the main characters, yeah, from this book is Xu Wen and Kechun. Kechun is the husband, Xu Wen is the wife. Yeah. Xu Wen is a dermatologist and Kechun is a surgeon. And because of his humanity value, yeah, Kechun wanted to serve Chinese soldier in Tibet. He wanted to cure and heal and treat the wounded Chinese soldiers there. But then after that, Shuwen never heard any news of Kechun, and then after that, he heard that Kechun is dead, but there is no news like how did Kechun die, and because of that, although Shuwen didn't really know much about Tibet culture and language, she then enrolled to be a doctor and then go and went to Tibet there. At that time, uh, she and her soldiers, yeah, so she was surrounded by Chinese soldiers, and they make a trip using trucks, yeah, trucks. So there are many trucks there, but the trucks were followed by Tibetan resistance, and the Tibetan resistance was really cruel, yeah, like they tried to kill the soldiers one by one, and usually the one whom they killed was the driver. So those rombongan itu ya, that rombongan need to, what is it, left the trucks and then move into another trucks, so left their belongings there. So like the situation was really bad. But one night then they met a woman, yeah, a wounded woman that is like unconscious, a Tibetan woman, and this Chinese soldier was actually so angry because their fellows are already killed by Tibetan resistance, right? So they wanted to kill the woman, but Xu Wen tried to, what is it, uh, prevented it, yeah, saying that we need this woman so this woman can communicate with the Tibetan resistance. So that's how Xu Wen rescued this woman. And then this woman then told her story. Her name is Zuoma, and she was the noble daughter. And when she was a child, she had some teachers. She had some teachers from China that taught her about the culture of China, and then taught taught her about Chinese language. And that's why she loved China, and then she went to China. And at that time, China had not conquered Tibet yet. At that time, they're still free. They're still free country. And then after that, after learning in China, yeah, studying in China, Zoma returned, and then she met a slave, yeah, a slave, and and he didn't have any name, and because she loved China, she then named this man with Tiananmen, and then they actually fell in love, but because the difference of the social status, they cannot be together. And at that time, uh, her dying father and then told her why he summoned her back, and it apparently the dying father was threatened by the Chinese soldiers. So like the nobles, they threatened the nobles to give them supplies, for their fighting against Tibetan resistance. And then the Tibetan resistance also wanted the noble the father's support. So it's like they were like dihimpit dari dua sisi gitu. Ya.
Gusti, kindly check the notes on the chat box and then please do summarize the key takeaways of the book. And
Oh
then
ya.
if there's any question that like to discuss, so we can manage the time pretty well for other.
Okay. So this is how this is. I will just like fast forward, yeah. So like Xu Wen then found the truth about the death of her husband. Yeah. So actually, her husband killed himself, sacrificed himself to save his soldiers from the Tibetan resistance, because at that time sky burial age. So if a Tibetan person died, they will not burn or bury the person, but they will cut the limbs, cut the organs, and then uh, what is it? Invited burung bangkai, ya. Invited the vultures to eat the bodies. But at that time, if this ceremony is disturbed, they believe that devil will eat the soul. And at that time, in the middle of the ceremony, there was actually a man that is still living, that's still alive. Yeah, and then he was attacked by the vultures, and then Kechun shoot the vultures. Yeah, Kechun shoot the vultures. So and the vultures went away, but then the Tibetan people was really mad. Were really mad there. Were really mad, and they almost killed the soldiers. And then Kechun said that he can invite the vultures back because he wanted to show them that Chinese people were not demon. They were a human just like them. So then he shoot himself, and then his corpse invited the vultures to eat it. And after that, the soldiers are safe, and then his story becomes a legend among the Tibetan. So after 30 years wandering in Tibet, and then living with the nomads, and even forgetting her identity as a Chinese, she then know the fact behind her husband's death. And why I decided to read this book, because I know this book from an author named Sinta Yudhisia. She wrote a psychology about love, and then she mentioned Sky Burial as one of the greatest love story that happened in the real time, in real life. That's why I wanted to read it. Yeah. And my takeaway from the books, uh, what is it? Yeah, it's like real love, true love can be really painful. I think it's my takeaway. Like her loyalty was spending 30 years to know the news about her husband, and not even a single one day she never doubt that she would know the truth. So like she hold that belief. in her heart until 3 decades. Yeah. And no question that I like to discuss. And maybe if you have any question, I'll try to answer it.
Thank you, Gusti. Everyone, please give a round of applause for Gusti. The book is Sky Burial by Shin Ran. It's a book. It's a love story book, yeah, Gusti. And then it's a nonfiction, but it's novelized already. So the plot and then the story and then the basically the story flow, it has been altered, or not really altered but customized into a novel. Anyone would like to ask some questions for Gusti?
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, I'm interested in the title. The title is Sky Burial, and I guess it's because the corpse were eaten by the vultures.
Yes.
My question is, what is the meaning, or why did they do that? What is the philosophy behind it? Because it is a strange, of course, a strange way of burying someone.
Well, they think that vultures are like the messenger of gods, and that they didn't burn the body because they felt like fire is too holy for the body, and then they didn't bury the body because the ground is too holy as well to contain the body. So that's why they then carry it and then feed it to the vultures in hoping that the soul will be delivered to gods, and then the soul can be reincarnated again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions for Gusti?
I have a
Oh.
question.
Sure, Pipit, let's go.
So this book was written by a third party, not the one who actually experienced it, right?
Yeah.
Is it correct?
Yeah.
What type of impression that this writer wants to portray the character? What's the name again? Shinran.
Shinran is the
Shinran.
author.
And who is the lady? What's the
Shuwen.
lady's name? Shuen.
Shuwen.
Okay. What type of impression does the journalist want us to see the woman? Because as you know, if she joined the Chinese army, that means in the history usually seen as the enemy, because you know China is quote unquote colonizing Tibet.
Yeah.
Right? But did the book mention anything about, you know, whether what China doing was wrong, or the book was trying to be neutral about it, not mentioning anything that China was the one at wrong here, colonizing Tibet?
The book is focused on the love story, not the political background of the uh, moment. Yeah, that's why I read this Dalai Lama to know the political background about Tibet and China, and then I also consulted to AI to know why China wanted to conquer Tibet. Yeah, and so Shinran met Shu Wen in 1994, right? And after that, Shu Wen told her the story, yeah. And then after that, Shu Wen went away, and no one knows whereabout her whereabout. Shu Wen told her that she actually looked for her family in China, because after she returned to China, she found that her families were no longer living in her house. So like she gone, and then after that, Shinran went to Tibet to do some research, and 10 years after her fated meeting with Chu Wen, she then published this book.
Okay, I think Dia is away. I have one more question. Unless Kak Mita has a question.
Yes. Gusti, my question is that you said that your key takeaway is that true love is painful. Do you agree with that, Gusti?
Yeah, I think, like books, movies are just capturing the beautiful things of love, yeah, but true love in real life also contains painful things, yeah, like how we like the more we love that person, the 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 worse our grief when the person is gone. And it happened in to Suwen, yeah. Like her marriage with Kechun is only lasted for months, yeah. So like she knows Suwen from from a kid, but then when she actually got married to Kechun, they only spent about 6 months before Kechun went to China and then lost. And still, even after that, she didn't move on. She spent 30 years wandering in Tibet. And she lived in the wild there, in the middle of the wild there. So she
See, I
didn't
think
live
she
in
just
the
wanted to have adventure.
city. No,
She
yeah,
wasn't
because
looking for her husband. She want to have a great adventure of her life.
no. It's not about adventure at all. If you read it, it's about the grief. Like so painful. Like, where is my husband? How did he die? Something like that. And uh, the moments that she actually lived with the nomad is actually like a accident, yeah, after the incidents. Yeah. So yeah, it's like fate after fate after fate until finally decades later she found out how her husband died. And how she knows, like, wow, really like a bit magical, yeah, because Tibet at that time, well, there is no cell phone at all and no technology and full of nomads. So they have like holy hills, yeah, ada bukit-bukit suci, like and those people believe that if you want to search for something, go to those hills. Yeah, so Suwen then went to those hills and then found certain messages, yeah, certain messages written by certain people, and then she know that, oh, this is. So it's like really fated there, like, wow. I didn't expect that she will actually know the reason behind her husband's death. It's really magical if you read it by yourself, yeah. And you can find the book on Shopee if you want. This book is an old book, yeah.
Okay,
And
thank you. Any
Gusti,
more
one more
questions?
question.
Otherwise, we will move to other participants.
Gusti, after she found out that her husband is dead, did she remarry or not?
No, no. She then went to China. She then will return to China and then look for her family. So like 30 years she spent to search for her husband news, and then after that she spent her years after that, her remaining years, to search for her real family in China. And nobody knows the continuation of her story because, yeah, she just gone. Whoosh.
Thank you, Gusti. Give a round of applause to Gusti. And Donald, are you ready to present the next?
Okay, thank you, Dias, for the time. The book that I want to present, the title is The Runaway Species. The subtitle is How Human Creativity Remakes the World. How Human Creativity Remakes the World. And it has two author. One of the author is a composer, and the other author is a neuroscientist. So this is an interesting book because it has two perspectives. One is from neuroscience and the other one is from art. So what is it about? It's about creativity, about how to be creative. Next, in the outline, in the chat, the second question, why did you decide to read the book? Because I'm interested in creativity. I always like to read about history or personal development. And this book is about something that is important, creativity. This book talks about the manufacturing age in the Industrial Revolution or manufacturing revolution. And then we have something called the information revolution after the manufacturing revolution, from the Industrial Revolution. And this book says that there could be the next revolution, which is creativity revolution. So after manufacturing revolution and then information revolution, there could be creativity revolution, and this book tries to distill the keys to creativity. So I read the book because I'm interested in how to be creative, like what this book is about. What are your key takeaway from the books? According to these books, the ingredients to creativity consist of three. And this is also one reason why I decided to read the book to completion, because I think this book puts the key to creativity in a simple way. There are three B's. The first one is bending. The second one is breaking. And the third one is blending. So quite similar to each other. They have rhymes. The first one is bending, the second one is breaking, and the third one is blending. The first one, blending, means you take something that exists, that already exists, and then you change the shape, maybe the size or the form or the amount. So you change the shape. This is bending. The second one is breaking. Breaking means you take something and then you break it down into smaller parts, and then you can eliminate some parts, or you can rearrange these parts into something new. And the third one is blending. Blending means you mix two or more sources to make something new. So it's quite simple. And with the examples from the book, I think this book has the correct hypothesis. Creativity is quite complex, but this book distilled it into just three: bending and then breaking and blending. And another key takeaway from the book besides this is that we need to proliferate options. That is one of the things that is also mentioned in the book. How can you bend and then break and then blend productively? So your goal is to proliferate options by using these three methods. You want to be able to create more alternatives. And after that, you want to filter some of them out, and then you get some which are the most promising to invest more in. And another thing is that you want the options to have different distances. This is also another key idea from the book. The illustration is a swarm of bees. A swarm of bees, when they try to find flower fields, to find honey, they, first of all, they have the current field, so they only try to use it, or just some of the bees in the swarm will go to adjacent fields, but then some of them will go to a faraway fields and try to find new places. In short, there are different distances, closer to the comfortable, and then you go farther and farther away, and you need all of this. So some of the options should be familiar, some of them should be less than familiar, and some of them should be wild ideas. You have all these options, and then you filter them out, you get some which are the best. So these are the key takeaways from the book, the methods with the three P's. And then with these methods, you want to proliferate options. And how do you make the options? You want to have different types of options, starting from the familiar one, and then less and less familiar. So different types. And then you filter the less promising ones, and you have the most promising ones. So that is the key takeaway from the book. Is there a question that you would like to discuss? No? Any question from the audience?
Anyone would like to ask questions to Donald? The book is The Runaway Species by Anthony Brandt and David Eagleman. When I googled both of these names, David is the neuroscientist of Stanford, and then Anthony Brandt is a musical composer. So it's a promising book about creativity because both are coming. One is someone who studied brains, and the other one is studied about music. So anyone would like to ask questions?
I'll go first. Donald, you said that we
Gusti
need
raised
to
her hand.
generate.
Let that be.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yes, can you see the hand signal?
Oh, I didn't see.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Can you see the hand signal? Gusti raised her hand after that me.
No, I didn't see. Sorry, Gusti. Gusti, sure.
Okay. Why the title is The Runaway Species?
Yeah, short but important question. Why the title is Runaway Species? Because according to this book, humankind, the species, have this unique ability to imagine what ifs. So actually, this book put it quite interesting, quite interesting way. I will try to find the exact quote, not to misquote. We learn facts. So this is about humankind compared to other species. We learn facts and generate fictions. We master what is and envisage what ifs. So other species, they can only look at the facts, but humankind, after learning the fact, generate fictions. Fictions is the imagination. We master what is, so we master what already exists, but we do not stop. We use what already exists as a springboard of innovation to imagine what if. Then what if I do this? What if I do that? Using the three Ps. So the title, The Runaway Species, is because this is the unique thing that humankind have compared to other species, and because of that, humankind run away. So leave the other species very far behind. Yeah, Pipit, please.
So it's not like
Yeah.
they run away from reality by creating those factions, but because they run far from any other species.
Yes, that's why the civilization on Earth, if you look from space, everything is almost all of them are made by one species only.
Yes, Gusti, is that okay? Donald's question?
Yes.
Okay. Pipit?
Okay, might be related to Gusti, but a bit different. Two questions. The first one is what is the function of creating this wild option? Right? If most likely it's called wild option is because it's almost impossible to be done. That's why it's wild option, right? So what's the function of making one if we're not gonna do it? That's number one. Number two, is there any real life example mentioned in the book when someone gave wild option as one of their options and he or she actually found that or chose that option? Or is it just to, like the extra step, but is there anyone who actually chose the wild option?
Okay, thank you, Bibit, for the question. The second one is about why. Is there anyone? The first one is, sorry, why? What? First one?
It's called wild choice is because it's very unlikely or it's like almost impossible to
What
be
is the
done.
function of that, right?
Yeah. So what is the function if it's in the end it's not possible to be done?
Okay, so for the first question, it is true that the wild ideas most likely do not come true. An example from the book is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci have this range. For the familiar one, he looked at the dam, the water canal in his city at that time. This is a very practical problem, and he worked on it to solve the problem with the water canal. This is a very practical problem. On the other hand, he dreamed things like flight, helicopter. These are things that are way ahead of his time. And it didn't happen, like Bibit said. But what I get is that by having these wild ideas, by allowing your imagination to run wild, you open the ways to new possibilities because you do not limit yourself. It is true that the helicopter that Da Vinci dreamed of didn't happen in his lifetime, but then because he didn't limit himself, we can see the creativity in many other things. Like in his painting is the most famous one. So I think the key thing is not to limit ourselves. Maybe the wildest idea will not happen, but we have this frame of mind of not limiting ourselves. And second, about people who actually take the wildest option, the book doesn't mention someone who take the wildest option, but I have another example that is not from the book. I think Einstein is a great example because the theory of relativity is so far away from our normal experience. It's wilder than wildest imagination. And I think you cannot go more extreme than that. Everything that we experience in our day-to-day is put upside down by the theory of relativity. For example, time is not fixed. We think 1 second is 1 second, but not. Actually, time is not fixed. Time is relative. What is fixed is only one thing, which is the speed of light. That is one thing that is very wild. The other one is space-time is actually curved. So these are all very wild ideas and proven to be true.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Any more questions for Donald before we moving on to the next discussion? Okay, then. Thank you, Donald. Pipit, would you like to go after Donald?
Yes.
Are you
Is my
ready?
voice okay or is it too loud in the background?
Before the background was a bit too loud, but now it's okay.
Okay. This one okay, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm in the spirit of August. I'm reading Bahasa book, Encyclopedia Sejarah Nasional. But actually, it's not just because of August. But starting from this year, I teach 2 classes of history class. So the previous years, only 1 class, which is grade 12. So starting this year, grade 11 as well. That's why I need to expand my knowledge about history. And I joke about it with Donald that I tried to somehow choose the short one. So then I just need to know the timeline. And then after that, I will expand it myself or with ChatGPT or something, to find out more about it. So that's why even though it's called Encyclopedia Sejarah Nasional, it's very considerably short, only 290 pages. And I joked about it with Donald because I think this book was written by AI. This book written by AI, I can tell. It's just the language, the format, the confusion, the ambiguity is very AI. And then I tried to find the, the ESBN, the serial number for published book. It doesn't have ESBN. So I think it's just someone try to make easy money, then sell this on Tokopedia. So that's what happened. But I'm okay. I mean, the reason why I bought this book in the first place is just to know the timeline. After that, I wanted to expand it by myself anyway. So at least timeline wise, it's all correct. So that's the intro about why I am reading this book right now. Right now, I'm in 198 page. So I'm like around 80% done reading the book. That's number 1 and 2. What are your key takeaway from the books? I have several key takeaway from the books, but mostly not related to history. Number 1 is how a lot of findings about the history of Indonesia themselves is actually written or found by people from outside Indonesia. So unfortunately, our ancestors did not really leave us good written record. So then that's why a lot of these stories and history about our ancient kingdom or even about the ancient humans were actually done by people from outside Indonesia. I think probably you still remember what we learned in high school or even in middle school about ancient humans of Indonesia, like Pithecanthropus erectus, Meganthropus paleojavanicus, Homo wajakensis, Homo florensis, all of this, right? All of these were excavated by Dutch and German archaeologists. Okay. And then after this Dutch pulled out of Indonesia, almost no known archaeologists from Indonesia continue their work, basically. So it's a little bit disheartening to see how a lot of this information about our ancient humans or our ancestors actually stop after the Dutch occupation is done. Yeah. So even though recently I know there was the oldest cave in the world excavated in South Sulawesi, but it was very rare. After decades of no more findings in Indonesia about our ancient civilization, then finally there was one. Okay, so that's how I felt sorry about. The next one is about our ancient kingdom. So unfortunately, even though I learned history in school, but I never heard of Holing Kingdom. Anyone heard of Kerajaan Kaling or Holing before? Right? So this is really amazing, this kingdom called Holing and Kaling. And the reason why it's called Holing, because the written record about this kingdom is actually found in China. There's not even this book on Goodreads. It doesn't even have ISBN, like I said. Okay. Holing is because it was a name given by Chinese priests who stayed at the Holing Kingdom for 3 years. But this was a pretty incredible kingdom located around Jepara, on the Jepara, Central Java. And what's amazing about it is that this is the first kingdom who had a queen as the head of the kingdom, basically. Usually king, right? But even in this ancient time of 650, we used to have a queen. And the queen was famous, called Ratu Sima, Queen Sima, because she was very fair, very different from our current rulers in Indonesia. Because that time, according to this written record in China, everyone obeyed the law in this kingdom of Holing. Yeah. If you by accident left your stuff by the street or you drop something in the market, no one would dare to touch it, basically, because they were afraid of breaking the law. And then one time, the crown prince, the Putra Mahkota, actually did something, abused his power. So he was surveying the market, and then he kicked one of the sellers dagangan, basically. He kicked one of the sellers pundi-pundi makanan, right? They call it. So, and then when the queen heard that her son did that, she sentenced him to death because of abusing his power against commoner, basically. So after that, the ministers somehow begged the queen to spare her son. Don't kill your son. We don't have anyone, who will be the next king if you killed your son. And then after that, she said, okay, then at least we have to cut off his leg. And that's what she did. She sentenced to cut off the leg of the crown prince that was used to kick this commoner's pundi makanan. Yeah. And this story was very, very impressionable to this Chinese priest. That's why he wrote it in his travel journey. Yeah. So he stayed 3 years in this kingdom, and that's one of the main sources of this Kerajaan Holing. Okay, so I'm really impressed by it. And a lot of other kerajaan, even the one that we know of, such as Sriwijaya, right? The main records where that became the base of our current history of Sriwijaya is actually from also Chinese priests, Buddhist priests who traveled and stayed in Sriwijaya. So all of this for me is such a learning experience, because why our ancestors did not leave us any record as good as other people who visited us. So I think this for me is such a shame situation. And last but not least is about religion. I think the one that I would like to share. So there's a part about how Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, how these three religions became the major religions in Indonesia. This book briefly talk about that through marriages, and then approaching the king, and then use the local art to proletize, that what the word? Yeah, spread the religion and things like that. My question in my mind was that why the influence of visitors are somehow bigger to us rather than our influence to them, basically. So Indonesia is like the persinggahan of this trade, right? Mainly between China and India. So we are just persinggahan, basically. When during this persinggahan or transit, a lot of people somehow try to spread the religion, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And then the local people of Indonesia embrace this religion, basically. But then my question is, why is it a one-way street, basically? Indonesia also had animism that time, which was worshipping the ancestors and then the nature, that right. But then they could not influence the visitors to go the animism way. Why is it one way? For me, it was interesting. That's number one. Number two, what I thought was interesting as well is we're supposed to be archipelago, but we did not have enough prowess and technology to actually explore the sea, unlike other civilizations that time. So even though we learned about how we used to have a really strong maritime kingdom, but then after reading this book, the maritime kingdom we had actually was not that strong. So we somehow stayed within our own area rather than explore to other parts of the world, basically. So I was a little bit questioning why our ancestors did not develop these seafaring technologies and stuff, even though I think the chances were supposed to be plenty because we lived in archipelago. While people in India or China, if they did not do seafaring, they could still survive because how vast the land is and how it is connected to other kingdoms. But why they were the one developing the seafaring technologies when there's no urgency to do so? While for us, it was supposed to be an urgency for us because we have such small islands compared to other islands. So I think that is the takeaway from this book that I got. That's it. Any question?
Thank you, Pipit. I managed to Google a bit about Ratu Sima, and it was interesting because she was the one who kind of initiate of what we may know about kisos. Kisos is if you find someone who I mean
Still.
red-handed stealing something, then the hand that did the hand that did the stealing gone because it's chopped like that
Yep.
piece. So I wonder if that law still, I mean, still with us nowadays. Maybe the crime will not so bad as it is currently happening because be careful guys. I don't know in other cities, but in Jakarta last week we were very warned about the begal situation because my office is located near the Sudirman area where basically the pedestrian area is pretty big. And it's near the MRT stations as well. But police always warn us about the begal. So it kind of reminded me of what happened last week. So any questions for Pipit? ChatGPT's book that somehow bring another inspiration to read other books about Indonesia?
Yeah, actually,
Yes,
I
Dono.
want to. Thank you, Dias. Actually, I want to give my theory about Pipit's questions about why they influence us and not us influencing them, and why they develop seafaring technologies and not us developing seafaring technologies. And my theory is that it is an information problem, which, which is evident from the fact that our ancestors didn't like to write down their knowledge. So all the knowledge were written down by foreigners. That means the foreigners have a more complete information system. For example, in terms of religion, Pipit mentioned animism. Animism didn't have any complete information, so there are many many questions you cannot answer. But the religion that came to Indonesia, they have more complete information system. They have a holy book, for example. So you can find answer about many questions from the holy book. And about the seafaring technologies, the same, because the ancestors didn't like to write down the knowledge. Every generation had to start from scratch. That's why the foreigners make the seafaring technologies. Just my theory. Your opinion, Pipit?
Yes, actually, I've heard about that. I told my lecturer about that too. Even in Java, there was a time when writing was not allowed. It's not even encouraged. It's not allowed. It was not allowed against the law to write. They call it because it's strictly budaya lesan. So it's oral culture. So they didn't even encourage writing. And then when I told my lecturer about that in a mocking tone, he gave me a book that somehow defended the local tradition. It's called somehow The Hegemony of Western Thinking, trying to make it look like basically local tradition, something like that is apa subserv apa ya namanya di bawahnya or
Inferior.
inferior to the Western thinking. But I forgot what the book was. He gave it to me. I haven't read it until now. But it's an actual book that somehow wanted to defend local tradition. Yeah. The same book also used in Australia when there is this tradition of women not allowed to play music in Aboriginal culture. And then the Western thinking somehow criticized that why only men were allowed to play music. And then after that, this book was thrown in front of them. It's the same book. So yeah, probably, yeah, actually, I'm on the same boat with Donald.
But if they depend more on local tradition, didn't it mean that
No, Gusti, it was Pak Misbahul Amri,
Huh?
You remember Pak Misbahul Amri?
Amri, yes.
Yeah, that's our lecturer who told me about that book. Gusti and I went to the same university, same jurusan.
Yeah. Yeah, but if our ancestors relies more on local tradition, doesn't it mean that their memories at that time is much brighter than people nowadays, right? Because they need to remember all the things.
I think so because TikTok ruined us. Kind
Oh,
of.
no. Well, yes, but TikTok ruins everybody, not just Indonesia. But in response to what Gusti said, yes, that kind of strained our memory to be maybe better, but there is always a limit to our memory, Gusti. And when knowledge is get passed down orally from point A to point B, person A to person B, there are always changes. It's not as preserved as written form. So yeah, I think it is a weakness.
Because I once discussed this thing with AI, but I asked about like why Prophet Muhammad cannot read. Yeah, why? And then why he didn't learn to read even though he then master all the Jazirah Arab, yeah. And AI told me that actually at that time in Arab, writing is considered as weakness. Means that you have good memories. If you so people at that time what is it recite poetries just by their memories because they have good memories at that time because writing is considered as weakness. But I don't know if the same thing also happens in our ancestors. Yeah.
Gusti, we went probably through the same thing, and I was also questioning why the first ayat that came down was actually read Iqra, but Prophet Muhammad did not learn how to read. So I feel somehow a little bit contradictory to me because kind of we were instructed to learn how to read, but then Prophet did not do it. But I also read a different version of history that later on after 2 years he did learn to actually read and write. Yeah, so it's not like he was ditahulu until he died, So yeah.
Yeah, he let make him didn't read because selain yang cultural construct tadi, tapi juga so people will know that he cannot write the teachings. So like the
Yeah.
teachings are really from God, not
Yeah, actually in Abrahamic or Judea religion, I think probably Donald can help me with this. There used to be an effort to write down all of this uh, teaching, and then it was actually opposed by the elders as well. So they went through the same problem. I think it was about maintaining the power, because if you know all of this, if in Islam is ayat-ayat, yeah, if you know all of these verses in your mind, well, other people did not know, you kind of have had the power, to rule, and everyone had to listen to you, everyone had to ask you. But if they put them in writing, somehow it becomes democratized knowledge. Now anyone can read it without even consulting with elders. So I think um a lot of society civilizations went through the same thing. But last month, I read the history of Egypt. It was the opposite. Those who could read and write were considered the best of the best. So the king had to know how to write, or all of the royal family basically. So that's why it's very unique. Yeah, there are culture who somehow do not allow writing or seeing writing as something frowned upon, but there are some other cultures
mm,
encourage writing.
mm,
I
yeah.
think my
Okay.
time is almost up.
Mhm. Thank you, Pipit. Do we still have time for me to share
Yes.
the book? Okay. I send the request share if
Yeah, I
you.
opened it just now.
Okay. Okay, everyone. So this is my book. Can you see the share screen over here?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'd like to present for this discussion is a book by James Fox. The title is The Boy in the Suit. The Boy in the Suit. And the reason why I decided to read the book is because I was participated in one of the Gramedia's Instagram post to join their what is Sayembara competition, like a contest. And basically the question was asking about whether how long have you been reading children's books, and what is the most children's book that inspired you, and then would you like to read uh, one of our first copy of the translation of The Boy in the Suit, and would you like to come for a offline discussion at Gramedia office? And Alhamdulillah, I won it. So I was one of their first readers. I got the book, the one that has not yet been designed. The cover was not accepted by their basically when you're in a corporate, you have to make approval like this, like that. The design for this book cover was still in a process of making, but I got this one with the title Advanced Reading Copy, Not for Sale. So this is the book that I read, and then the story is about a boy named Solo, not the Solo that we know, yeah, guys. The Solo and his mother, single Solo and his mother, they were living in a very poor situation, and he was instructed by his mom to use their big blazers, and they always go to the funeral. What is that? Yeah, funeral ceremony. So it's a bit different. It's a bit cultural differences, I think, because in the West, when someone dies, they have a funeral, and then they have like a feast, somehow like a feast. And the higher the profile of the almarhum or almarhumah, the higher and also the more fancy the event is or the party is, and they go routine like once every week and getting more frequent by going to the funeral, and then as if they were the one of as if they were invited to that ceremony or to the feast. And one time they got caught, and Solo was having this trouble in school because now everyone knows that the poor boy is in the school. So the story was for me it's very heartbreaking, and I was questioning why Gramedia decided to put this as one of the children's book, because I thought it was for young readers. It's the difference, children's book and young readers book. Young readers means pre-teenager, but then they decided to put it as well in the children's book because for them and based on their judgment, it's good for children to learn about poverty, and it's good for children to know that there are different kinds of background, different kinds of culture that exist. So my key takeaways from the book is that first, the line between embarrassment and loyalty is somehow blurred, because when it comes to family, you're willing to do everything just to help, just to provide. And then the second one, the relationship between mother and children is often imperfect because there's no such thing as perfect relationship in the family, but yet it's very compelling in this, especially in this book. And then for me, the most personal one is for me revisiting the children's literature. For me as an adult, was able to reveal meanings, including about life. So I thought children's book is okay, it's for children, but if you reread or if you do know how to approach that children's book, it's actually become more it's very interesting because you have been lived this for this past 20-30 years, and then you do know you have lots of point of views, and it's getting to, it brings lots of deep thinking. So I think it's a very good experience. It's a good journey for me as well. And for me, the good thing about this book is because the themes about poverty and the oh sorry and about the wait and about the social media is somehow was not really talk enough, I think. But um this book really teach us about the meaning of poverty, social media, friendship, and also about the relationship between you and your family. And then wait guys, one last thing about um for me, my personal experience of this book is 4.5 out of 5. And a question I'd like to ask in this discussion is there any children's book or a book that you read during your childhood that you'd like to reread again? That would be my question for you guys. Thank you. Anyone would like to ask questions? By the way, the book is on Goodreads. You can maybe have a look on the preview over here. Yeah, I shared the link already. Okay, anyone would like to ask questions for this book? Sure. Kamita.
Yes. I just want to answer your question, like what book I read when I was little, that I still remember. Actually, I have a lot, yeah, of the books that I still remember because it wasn't about the book that made me remember the titles or the books, everything, but when I was little, my father had to leave so early before I woke up. he had to leave work before I woke up, and he came home very late after I went to bed. But the most interesting thing is that he always brought me books to read whenever he came home. And the books that touch my heart, one of them is about Pandawa. I think it's from Mahabharata, but the books were comic books. So he bought me a series of Mahabharata comic books. And I always remember the Pandava brothers, how the values they uphold as people, how they had to go through all the troubles and challenges in life given by Kurava, the 100 brothers who are mean to them. So that taught me how to persevere in life as a person. You don't give up easily. And the wisdom I learned, numbers mean nothing, but wisdom means a lot. Yeah, because Pandawa only 5, but Kurava has 100 people, but they're bad people, and it means nothing. So for us, if you only like a small group like these book brewers, but we are good people, so it's a brilliant thing, it's a wise thing to do. So that's my answer to you. Yes, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Kamita. Anyone else would like to answer my question, or maybe you'd like to ask question about the book? Sure, Gusti.
Okay. So just like Mbak Mita, I want to share about a special children book that unfortunately I don't have it anymore. So I forgot about the title of the book, but I first learned to read by reading this book. So this book is a collection of tales with soft and pastel colored illustrations, dreamy like with teddy bears. So like the relationship between teddy bears and their owners, usually girls, and these teddy bears are alive. So even though they are like a stuffed animal, but when their owner slept, then they come to live. And one of the most memorable tale of this book is how the owner often got nightmare, and then this teddy bear was so restless and then so worried about its owner, and then he decided to become the watcher of the nightmare. So whenever its owner got a nightmare, the teddy bear then watch the dream and then shove it away. And years after that, now after I'm adult, I stumbled into like a random page about a Western folktale, and it is said that yes, in the Western country there is a folktale about how teddy bear is made uh, to chase out those nightmares from the children. But I think it's also because teddy bear is created to be like a comfort doll, comfort companion for the children that cannot sleep and then need to hug, and then they can sleep better while hugging the bear. But I think this folktale is really like memorable, and I really hope that someday I will find the book again miraculously on Shopee or on Tokopedia. Yeah.
Thank you, Gusti. Anyone else would like to raise up questions? Otherwise, we will move forward to Pipi, do we still have the time?
Yes, 10 minutes.
Okay, Kamita, would you like to present next?
Okay, with 10 minutes, I will present this book that I have. It's called Homeopathy, I don't know if you can see clearly. Okay, like this. An A to Z home handbook written by Alan V. Spooker. So the reason why I chose this book is that I just want to share quickly my experience using homeopathy, because during the pandemic, including everyone, including my father, who's a doctor, panicked because of the COVID-19. And I was actually at that time struggling with my son's schizophrenia. And a good friend of mine, they have a daughter who has lupus. Lupus is an autoimmune illness. And they recommended me to learn homeopathy from Chok Gede Tirtayasa, a practitioner based in Ubud, Bali. And his organization is called Tirta Usada. So I took the course online during the pandemic, and Alhamdulillah, praise God, I've gained a lot of benefits, especially for treating COVID-19. And I haven't had serious flu for a long time since the pandemic. Maybe just a little masuk angin, but only one day, and I took homeopathy with multivitamin, and I'm fine. So what are the key takeaways from this book and also from my experience learning homeopathy? Homeopathy is an effective natural remedies. It is safe, affordable, free of chemical side effects. And it has been established worldwide and used by 500 million people. It is unique in offering remedies to prevent and alleviate both common and serious ailments. So let me give you an example. When I had COVID for the first time, I stayed in Wisma Athlete, and the doctor prescribed me the antivirus, which was so strong and so confusing to take because of the high dosage. Yeah, but after that, I did not recover well because I had like thick blood. I had started having the ringing ears and everything like that. So the antivirus had very negative side effects after the COVID. So when I got the second COVID, I did not want to use the antivirus. I just took the vitamins and I took homeopathy. And what happens? Because homeopathy is not healing you, but it triggers your body, the parts of your body, to heal yourself. So after I had the second COVID, when I recovered, my condition was much better. Even that all the diseases and illnesses I had before the COVID, it recovered. So that's why I recommend you to learn about homeopathy by sharing this book. So what's the benefit of the homeopathy? Based on the book, the research in this book, they say that influenza epidemic in 1980 killed 20 million people worldwide. When the survival rates were only 70% with conventional medicines, hospitals that use homeopathy to treat that influenza epidemic had 98% successful rates. So that's one of the reasons why I use homeopathy instead the antivirus from the allopathy doctors for my second COVID. And who introduced this homeopathy in the beginning? It was introduced by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, a German physician, in the period of 1790 to 1843. He was a pharmacist, a translator fluent in 7 languages. He was also the first people who promoted compassionate treatment for the mentally ill. So another reason why I learned homeopathy, because my son has schizophrenia, and I use this as an additional treatment to the allopathic medicine. So he used homeopathy to cure so many individuals with mental illness. How did he start? First, he experimented on himself, and then his families, and then friends, just like I do. I use homeopathy for me, for my COVID. I used that for my neighbors and my family who had COVID, for my son to prevent COVID, and now for additional medicine for my son who has schizophrenia to calm his down, especially to avoid relapses. So what he found out is that to cure without harm, use the least amount of medicine necessary. And homeopathy is a substance that causes symptoms of illness that can cure those same symptoms. It works similar to the vaccines. So that's all my experiences and the key takeaways I got from this book. So I hope this information can help you to be more interested to learn more about homeopathy because it has been beneficial for me, for my neighbors, for my friends, and for my family. Any questions?
Thank you, Kamita. Anyone would like to ask questions about homeopathy?
When we want to do homeopathy, can we do it ourselves? For example, if we read a book and then do it to ourselves, or do we have to see a doctor or something?
Good questions. Just like any other medication, I highly recommend you to consult with a homeopathy practitioner. There is one in Jakarta that I usually consult because my neighbor also consults with her. Her name is Bu Alin Mumu. I can share you the information through the WhatsApp group. So this is a non-profit organization. The office is in the one of the mosques. I forgot the name of the mosque, but usually what I do is I call her or I text her and she will recommend me the homeopathy accordingly to my symptoms. And they can go send it, but if you want to go to see her in person, you can go there. And they don't charge because it's a non-profit, but I usually pay voluntarily. So ikhlasnya, yeah. So and another one is my guru, Chok Gede Tirta Yasa in Ubud. We have a group, a WhatsApp group, Tirta Usada. So usually we ask about recommendations from him or from all the group members because all the group members have taken the homeopathy lessons, just like I did. I took a course for almost 2 years on homeopathy. So this is too late to share with you, but I'm professional in terms that I'm confident to use homeopathy for my family, friends, neighbors, and me because I took the course like there were like 24 hours intensive during the weekend online, and then every week they provided like a 4 hours course for learning each remedy. So the group is Tirta Usada. You can Google on website. They have contacts, they have information, and you can ask for their recommendations for homeopathy remedy for you. I hope that answers your question, Peter.
Thank you, Kamita.
Thank you,
Okay.
Kamita.
Because of the time, I'll return the control back to the moderator, Diaz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamita. I think everyone has shared the book, and thank you for the discussion. Can we present the book so we can take the photo,
Take
guys?
photo one more time because earlier Kamita did not join. My class will start in 4 minutes, so we're kind of safe. I'm gonna take photo. 3, 2, 1. Okay. See you guys next month.
See you next month. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
great weekend.